Time to get inspired and improve your yoga knowledge in English. You're listening to Your Yoga in English, a podcast for yogis and yoga teachers that speak English as their second or third language and want to practice or teach yoga worldwide. I'm Annie, the founder of Enga Unite, and here to guide you on the way to become the confident and knowledgeable English-speaking yogi you want to be. Hello, hello! Yes! How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you, Annie?
Good, thank you. I'm really excited.
Yeah, me too.
Today we're going to speak about applying the Yamas and Niyamas in our yoga classes. We've had a little bit of contact about how to address this topic because it's a very, very broad topic we are speaking about today.
Yeah, and I mean, broad and a lot of different ways to approach it and a lot of different interpretations as
Absolutely.
well. So it's, I think it's very interesting, but also very much the core of a lot of teacher trainings, I think, are sort of like centralizing Yamas and the Niyamas as the core of yoga, if you like. We talk about the 8 limbs yoga, Patanjali's 8 limbs yoga system, and of course this is from Patanjali, and it's it is the 8 limbs.
Exactly. Now, before we dive in, I want to introduce you a little bit, and obviously I want to hear a little bit from you as well. So for the people that don't know, we have spoken to Thomas before. Thomas is a yoga teacher with many years of experience. And he's my yoga teacher, and I love the way he structures the classes and brings in yoga principles and philosophy. And I think it's very, very inspiring. And also gives a little bit of food for thought every class. It really helps to reflect on your own life and on your practice. So I thought, we want to speak about themes. We want to speak about the Yamas and Niyamas, and you would be the perfect person to ask. Tell us a little bit about yourself. You might not think that
after the conversation.
Oh no, I'm sure. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself as well?
I started practicing yoga back in 94, and it was sort of a little bit by chance because I moved to London and I was at drama school, and my head of movement was a yogi. So he had us doing very physical yoga, a very physical practice, and that was kind of like the foundation of how he was teaching us mainly about how to understand the body. And it wasn't really until a few years later, after I left drama school, that I realized that it was yoga that we were doing, and that was only because I started doing actual yoga classes. And I sort of, hang on, I've done this before. I spend a lot of time exploring. So I was very much a vinyasa yogi. I like the flow and the sort of like, dynamic yoga. It was very useful for me at the time. But I spent a lot of time exploring other branches as well because I was curious, and being an Aquarius, I think that's something that apparently has to do with that. I was always very interested in the spiritual. Even when I was a child, I was very alert to anything that came to spirituality, religion, and I always sort of like had this sort of like unified feeling with everything that came in. So that was when I found yoga. I kind of like, oh, hang on, this is a practice and teachings that are actually saying what I've been feeling in my heart all along. Because I always sort of like felt that when you boil any spiritual teaching down at their at the core, they're the same thing, and this is exactly what yoga teaches us without being a religious thing. It's a practice where we can, work on our spirituality without it necessarily having to be attached to one specific way of faith.
Exactly.
And that was what really resonated with me with yoga, and that was what was also kind of when you come to the Yamas and the Niyamas and the 8 limbs of yoga. And I think it's important that we look at the whole of that sort of like section. That kind of describes the system of yoga in the way that it is a very scientific way. I mean, maybe not scientific in the way that we understand science today, but it was a scientific method of its time, and it's a scientific method in the sense that it's a technique that you use, and it's not a matter of oh, if you believe it, or if you, it's sort of like, it is literally, well, if you observe this and if you practice in this way, you will have an understanding or an experience, and of course we all have our individual and personal journeys with that. And what we add on top of that may be a belief system, or it may be a way that we interpret it. But yoga doesn't really talk about that. It doesn't tell us, oh, you've got to, that's sort of like where we may go to religion for that.
Exactly. Actually, now that you're speaking about this, I remember reading the Yamas and Niyamas for the first time, and obviously studying it in the first yoga teacher trainings as well. To me, it always comes across as some type of morals, disciplines, and a lot of it actually has to do, or not has to do, but there's a lot of similarities of things that we see in religion. Could you maybe give us a summary of what the Yamas and Niyamas actually are?
Yeah, I mean, forgive me if I go on a little bit about this, but there's a few points that I think are important to understand in what these are. So the 8 limbs of yoga is, the first 2 limbs are the yamas and the niyamas. And that's basically, so the yamas are kind of restraints. They're like restraints, so they're things that you avoid doing, or that you restrain yourself from doing. And then you have the niyamas, which are like observances. So they're things that you would encourage yourself to do, as in your practice and as part of your life as a yogi. Beyond those 2 steps, we also have asana, which most of us know because that's the physical, the postural practice. We have pranayama, which is the breath practice. So these limbs, where most people that have done a yoga class will be familiar with the asana and the pranayama, because that's all we ever talk about. And then you have pratyahara, which is withdrawal of the senses. You have your dharana. My Sanskrit is appalling, and I do apologize. Which is intense focus, which leads to dhyana, which is a state of meditation. And then you have your samadhi, which is your state of oneness. And if you go, I mean, Patanjali Sutras actually describe, I think it's about 9 different states of samadhi, but in terms of the 8 limbs, we just say samadhi is the 8th limb. Now, the one point I would like to make before I go deeper into the yamas and the niyamas is a point that my teacher, Mark Whitwell, who was a teacher of Krishnamacharya, and this sort of like rebirth of yoga, in a sense, that Krishnamacharya brought into the world. They're very specific about what a practice is and what we actually can do in a practice. And the one thing that we're most familiar with is that we sort of like usually say that step, the limb 1, 2, so the yamas, the niyamas, the asana, the pranayama, the withdrawal of the senses and the intense focus is something that we can do. In reality, when we're practicing, the only thing that we really have control over, that we actually can say we're going to practice this and do this, is asana and pranayama, so posture and breath. And all the rest of the limbs are kind of understood to arise from there. Now, we always understand this sort of practice, the things that we do, then the states of meditation and samadhi. We don't have control over whether they arise or not. We can sit down and meditate, but that doesn't mean that we fall into a state of meditation. We call it a practice for a reason, and sometimes we just sit and meditate, and all we do is, notice how distracted we get, which can also there's an element to the yamas and the niyamas that we do have some control over, because of course we can make choices in our lives according to these sort of like things. But there's also elements of these practices where we may not have as much control as we think. So before I get into all of that, because it is massive, let's just run through. So we have the first 2 limbs of yoga, and that's what we're focusing on in this talk. The yamas and the niyamas, the restraints and the observances of yoga. So the yamas, the restraints of yoga. Here we're talking about ahimsa, which is non-harming or non-violence. We got satya, which is telling the truth or not lying. And then you got asteya, which is non-stealing. And some people say non-coveting, not desiring what is not yours. Then you got your brahmacharya, which is interpreted in a lot of ways. Traditionally, it's usually been linked to celibacy. In a broader sense, it's controlling of our energy, or cultivating our energy. or our life force, if you like. And then you got your aparigraha, which is non-hoarding, so non-greediness. Now, the observances, so the things that we do encourage to do, would be things like saucha is cleanliness, to do with, you keep your body clean, you keep your mind clean, you keep your surroundings clean, because it helps you focus, it helps you help your clarity. Santosha is contentment. Yeah, contentment I interpret as being happy with where we are rather than desiring to be somewhere else. And that is actually very poignant, specifically in yoga practice.
Absolutely.
Very non-content in our practice. Tapas is another observance, and that's, I tend to think of it as discipline, or the sort of the fire of yoga, you do something regularly and you do it regardless, and you keep yourself to it. Swadhyaya is self-study. So obviously that's what we're doing in the practice, and it's an important part of yoga is that we're studying the self, because we're connecting to the self. That's the aim of yoga. And the last one I've been trying to pronounce for years, and I always get it wrong, and people always correct me. Yes, you can tell my Sanskrit really is appalling, but Ishvara Pranidhana is surrender. And it's funny that I can't pronounce it, because it's probably the one I feel is the most important. They're all important, everything. But I find that surrender is kind of like this place that we can go to when everything else gets a little bit too much. Let go, and the more we do it, the more we start realizing that actually, letting go is quite often a solution. It can be hard to do, but it can also be very beneficial.
Exactly.
So that's a lot right there. And we can kind of see how in just running down over there, I'm assuming anyone who's done a teacher training, I have notes, like endless notes and schematics all around. Every notebook I have probably have a version of this somewhere in it. And every teacher training you do, everyone you talk to, there's slightly different interpretations of different points, but they're all, more or less the same thing. The essence is the same. And there's just so much in there. And you can see how it can very quickly become, do this, don't do that.
Yeah.
It can very quickly become rules. My feeling is it's never been intended to be rules. Like, say, for instance, that I want to practice ahimsa. So I want to be a less violent person. So I want to force myself or tell myself that I will not commit any acts of violence, and I will be moderate in whatever that sort of like means to me. And that can be quite a hard thing to do. So in some senses, it's easy. It's easy to sort of like say, well, don't beat people up. Another way we look at it, especially when we're practicing, is don't be violent towards yourself. Don't push, pull back. Now, if all I do is just tell myself not to be violent, but say that maybe my personality or my sort of, identity is very aggressive or very violent. Maybe I had a, traumatic upbringing, and, I'm very angry, which would tend to, and I just sort of like to say, okay, well, I want to stop being violent. I'm probably going to get very, very frustrated with that, because the anger and the frustration will still be there. And I will probably be able to control myself in a lot of situations and be less violent and think less violent thoughts even. But quite often what we find in those situations is that then that aggressiveness that's still there will express itself in another way. So if you previously were very violent towards other people and you decide willfully to stop that, quite often what we see is that people get more violent towards themselves and get very hard on themselves and and I'm not saying that that's not something that's worth exploring, but it's a very difficult thing to do, and it's not necessarily fruitful. Now, when we practice and when we start practicing the simple things that we can control, like the breath and the movement, we may find that these changes, so for instance, nonviolence, and that's just an example, it could be any of them, will start arising in us. So we start feeling that actually we become more aware of ourselves, we become more aware of the way our actions reflect other people. And that might lead to us, change towards observing nonviolence might become less effortful through the practice. But that, of course, also depends on the mindset we practice with. And I suppose that's why when we practice yoga, I think it's important if we call it a yoga class and that we are giving more than just a series of postures and breathing in here, breathing out there, and we give more than just the physical technique. That we allow people to connect with the different layers and the reflections in the practice as well.
Exactly. What you said, you gave the example of practicing, for example, non-violence in your yoga class or in life, or letting go. These are really great themes for yoga classes as well. It's something I often use as a theme, but I don't often actually then use the Sanskrit name for the Yamas and Niyamas for it. Do you think it's important that when you theme your class something like letting go or non-violence, we also refer to the Yamas and Niyamas in Sanskrit?
Okay, so I'm going to sound a bit like a hypocrite here, because obviously I just demonstrated my sort of like very inept pronunciation of Sanskrit. And for me personally, I got quite a lot of dyslexia, and learning different languages has always been hard for me, and I don't read very well, and pronouncing things. And I'd literally, unless I'm sort of like using a word every day, I really have to think about how to pronounce it, and quite often a few different ways, and then I might sort of like get near. All the same, I do feel that we owe it to our teachers and to the teachers that went before them, and for their heritage. This isn't a system that somebody came up with, a few hundred years ago, and this is a system that's survived in its integrity for 5,000 years. And yes, of course, it's changed, and yes, we have added things into the way we practice today is very different from the way that it may have been practiced, thousands of years ago. But it's, in essence, it's the same thing. We still go back to the same Patanjali sutras, where we take the idioms from, is the origin. And I think for that reason alone, I think we owe it to the practice to pay respect to that. And one of the ways that we can do that is by using Sanskrit, because it has a resonance to the original language where this comes from. The other thing about using Sanskrit, we kind of touched a little bit on so say, for instance, Ashteya is one of these sort of, or Brahmacharya. Those are two things where, depending on what class you go to, depending on what teacher you talk to, depending on, you could get translations. If you just ask them what's the translation of Brahmacharya, one person would say celibacy, one person would say retaining of life force, one person would say direction of life force. Now, in our language, these things are vastly different. Yeah. But Brahmacharya is a specific term, and it covers all of those. Yeah. So if we call it Brahmacharya, we have the scope for it to mean all of the things that we may translate it into. And in translating it from Sanskrit, we're forced to also consider actually what is the meaning of it, and what is the meaning to me personally. Now, I completely understand why people hesitate to use Sanskrit in classes. And I think that's also a valid choice. There are other ways that we can, pay respect to the lineages and stuff. And I know that you're very aware of that as well. And I also know that when you teach classes, we as teachers are very aware of our audience and how to connect to the audience. Sometimes, you may feel that maybe it's not appropriate to be all Sanskrit. Maybe they'll put people off.
Yeah.
my personal approach to that is I always use Sanskrit in some way or form, not in an excessive way, but I will never say something in Sanskrit that I don't say an English version of if I'm teaching in English. Mm-hmm. So if I say, let's come into Tadasana, then I would say, let's come into Tadasana, mountain pose. Mm-hmm. You know, so it's not like, what did he say? So there are ways of approaching it. I think it's a valid choice to say, okay, well, if you know that your students, for instance, are struggling understanding what you're saying in the first place, because maybe you're teaching a class where everybody is a second language student. Say you're teaching in English, but you're teaching in a resort in Spain, and your students, none of them English is the first language, and maybe they're not fluent, and they're already working very hard to understand you, and then throwing in a really odd sounding word that they never heard before. So that could be a reason to sort of say, well, actually, this session, maybe I don't bring in the Sanskrit because it's too much, because there's already a language barrier or whatever. Now, in the same class, say that these are, people that have practiced yoga in their own language for a while. Then I would say, well, actually using the Sanskrit terms would probably be easier, because that's, those are terms that we all understand and we all share. And it doesn't matter if you did your teacher training or your yoga practice in Germany or in Japan or in India or whatever language you did it in, these terms, unless I'm pronouncing them, of course, will all sound the same to us. Yeah, as you can see, there's arguments for, there's arguments and against. What I don't like about the current culture that's happening right now, and I am going to speak out about this, is when organizations that we work for dictate to us what choices we should make. You got fitness chains, and that kind of like say, oh, you're teaching yoga, but we don't want you to use the Sanskrit terms because our members are here for the fitness. Yeah. I recently had an assessment. I teach at a gym chain in London, and I was deducted points because I used the chant Om at the end, which to me is very inoffensive. And I said, oh, but it's not really, the essence of what the chain is about. And I said, well, to me, that means you shouldn't offer yoga. If your customers do not want yoga, you shouldn't offer it. Now, I'm not saying that every teacher should use the Sanskrit terms or whatever, but I'm saying that those of us who this is how we connect to the authenticity of the practice should be allowed to do that at our discretion. And I think, I'd like to think that as teachers, we have enough of a feel for our students when we're teaching to understand whether it will be helpful or whether it won't be helpful. And one of the things about using these terms and using Om and is that the people in the groups that are interested and maybe don't understand will usually come and ask you, and it can be an opening for a conversation where you can maybe get people that you're teaching from a very fitness-oriented perspective to inquire deeper into what the practice is. And ultimately, I do feel that if we say we're teaching yoga, even if we're teaching in the fitness environment, we should aim to teach yoga and not fitness. And
let's come back to including or applying Yamas and Niyamas in your yoga classes. Something that we often hear, and I actually hope that most trainers do teach their students, that they have to practice their yoga off the mat or really understand what they're teaching before they apply it in their yoga classes or their themes. In terms of the Yamas and Niyamas, what does this really mean? You already explained that these are different restraints or disciplines. Often they are referred to as morals as well.
The Yamas are kind of like things that you avoid.
Yeah.
Things that you want to take away from your life or, do less of. And the Niyamas are observances, so they're things that you want to encourage.
Exactly.
So you want to encourage yourself to feel contentment, and you want to discourage yourself from stealing, from other people. And they really are kind of like very similar to what you find in, any kind of spiritual teaching or religion or anything, and they're sort of like along the same lines. It's basically sort of like, be a good person. We all know it's more complicated than that. So in terms of taking this off the mat, it's a lot to do with awareness, what we're practicing in the practice as we're going inhale, exhale, pay attention to this. A lot of it is awareness. It's about awareness. That's the whole thing. That's what gives rise to the meditative states. If we get those, I think the awareness in our day-to-day life is what we can take off the mats. Because I think it's the difficult thing if we make it, you should observe these in your day-to-day life. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You should never, now you're practicing yoga, you must never squash a fly, because you've got to be non-violent to all things. But we all also know that it's not as simple as that. We all know that, we may say, okay, I'm practicing non-lying. I don't want to lie. I'm a truthful person. Mm-hmm. But we all know that once in a while,
Exactly.
And not even quite often, for good reason or whatever, it's not. But I think the way to bring it off the mat is bring awareness to it. Mm-hmm. So we study these things and we talk about these things, and then we start becoming aware, and then you kind of like notice. And it's not really that, that you did something wrong, but you just notice, actually, I told a lie there, mm-hmm. And I told it for this reason. And why? Was there a different way I could have handled that situation where I wouldn't have been dishonest? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Brahmacharyas, I always think it's interesting, especially with the celibacy thing. And in the tantric tradition, there's a lot of brahmacharya practices aimed at men because, we're kind of, I think that's a very cultural thing. We're kind of encouraged to, let the energy go, plant your seeds, spread it around everywhere. So there's a lot of these sort of like exercises, yogic exercises and tantric exercises that teaches men how not to ejaculate, or how not to ejaculate immediate, how to prolong the sexual intercourse, and also build up the energy and be aware that what we experience as sexual energy is still energy, and energy transforms and it can be used in different ways. Mm-hmm. So all of these lessons, they're encompassed within brahmacharya. But of course, we're not going to sort of like be very rigid about that and say, if you're practicing brahmacharya, or even if you say you're practicing celibacy, which is, for a lot of people, a spiritual practice in itself, you never ejaculate, because that would be unhealthy in a different way. But you may, I think B.K.S. Iyengar said that he would ejaculate with his wife once a month. So he was very disciplined about mm-hmm. the way he was practicing that, but he wasn't completely abstaining, no. So I think there's a lot of awarenesses to bring into this, and I also think it's fluid. It's not that there's a complete right or complete wrong, that you're never going to be a yogi or your practice is useless if you tell a lie once in a while, or if you step on a snail, or if you...
And I think a lot of this also applies to how you are to yourself, or how you treat yourself. I think very often we don't really even consider or are aware how, like you said, how hard we are on ourselves, or how many things we expect from ourselves, or how unhappy we are with who we are and what we do in the moment.
Yeah, and this thing about beating ourselves up.
Yeah.
Which I think, most of us recognize that, don't we? That's a form of violence. This thing of sort of like, I lied. I did this. I did that. Or that's a form of violence. It's not healthy, constructive reflection on an action or whatever. It's telling ourselves off again and again and again. Now, when we're practicing, we can be aware of these things. We can be aware of these concepts, and we can quite often see how we're treating ourselves. If we always push in our practice, that's a form of violence towards ourselves. Yeah, we're trying to force the body. We're trying to force ourselves to achieve something, to get deeper into the posture, to be more flexible, to be able to stand on our hands. All of these things. It's sort of like, and that can be a form of violence. And there's a difference between that and the tapas, the discipline, which gets us to practice, mm-hmm. which we will encourage. So I think both in practice and in life, the best way to work with these things is with awareness.
Exactly. Very nice. Now I want to know how to practice them on the mat and actually include them in the classes that we teach. Because this is a whole different story. How do we transmit this kind of information in a yoga class?
This is from a teacher's perspective, a big topic, because when we start teaching, You know, we're quite often feeling out of our depths. We need something like a structure to hold on to. Now, I got to be completely honest here that I tend never to, I mean, I do use themes of sorts, but I never sort of like pre-plan them, you know, because they kind of come up. What I found when I was starting teaching was that I would have all these plans, and I would say, oh, I'm doing this sequence and I'm doing this posture, and the theme is this because that ties in with, and then I can, you know, and I had all these sort of like complicated things going on. And I never used them because when I was in front of the class and you see what's going on, then you sort of like think, oh, you know, actually, if out of, you know, 20 people, you have 5 people with lower back issues and 2 people with hip issues, and then maybe your full-on camel sequence with 25 back isn't the appropriate sequence to do with that group of people, because there may be other ways that you come there. And the same thing with the themes, and you quite often see that when you teach a group of people, that there's sort of like something that they all have in common. I mean, and that could be maybe a thing like pushing. You know, so maybe you came in and you were going to talk about you know, contentment, and that could be applied to pushing, but it could also be nonviolence. So you could apply to all these things in a lot of different ways. So I found I shifted the sequences, I shifted what I was speaking about, and then I found that what kind of starts happening is you start channeling, you know, from the group, and then you come into these themes. You know, you come into these themes. And my first teacher training, she was very into that. The kind of like, you just go in blind, go with the flow, and whatever comes out of the mouth is meant to come out. And I was terrified. It took me 4 years before I was actually feeling I had courage to stand up in front of the class without trembling. When you first start teaching, or if you're teaching in maybe in an unfamiliar language or in your second language, then having a theme, having something to go to can be incredibly useful. Now, I would really warn against being too scripted about it. You know, I wouldn't necessarily write it out and sort of like say, I'm going to talk about this in this section or this in that section. But what I would do is I would maybe write out themes and explore the themes. So say that you are using santosha, contentment. Then you could explore, okay, what does contentment mean to me? So that could be one thread. What does contentment mean in terms of accepting a class that you're in, accepting a posture, accepting where your body is? So there's all these like different, and the more you kind of like reflect on those things, the more things you're going to have to talk about in the practice. So when you set up your theme at the beginning of the practice, you set up the theme, and then as you come back in and you see in a certain posture, you see, oh, you know, a lot of people are, you know, trying to push too hard, and it's like they're not really satisfied with where they are. And then you can bring in the same theme in a different way at different points, and then so you're always coming back to this theme, but you're not locked. So it is important to come back to it, because otherwise sometimes it feels a little bit like, okay, well, you talked a little bit about this at the beginning, and then you came back to it at the end, and in the middle there was nothing.
This happens. It happens that you forget about it, but it's true. We should always come back and refer back to it in different ways, 3-4 times in the class. What you said is a really, really, really good point, to reflect on what the theme means to you, and maybe even reflect on what it could mean to others, and then having like little elements of, for people that are non-native English speakers, have little bits of vocabulary that relate to these themes, or little topics, maybe examples or situations that could relate to these themes to refer back to. So you could create kind of like a theme bank for yourself. This is something we do in the courses. You create a theme bank for yourself. You got contentment. What does it mean to me? What could it mean to others? And then just have vocabulary there. And that way you don't have to worry about it so much. I really like that. Now, I want to hear about an example. You already gave a few examples. Actually, before I ask about examples, channeling. I know the term, it's a term that we often see in yoga, but it might not be very clear what this means. Could you explain that to us?
Okay, so my first encounter with channeling was very sort of like spiritual. I went to this center, healing center, for treatments, and they would channel, to the spirit world, and that was how they paired therapists. And I did a lot of work for them. Like one of the things that they did, it was kind of one of the easements of the place, and that's a specific way of channeling. And that a lot of people think these things when you say the word channeling, people say, oh, it's very spiritual. And it's all about listening to ghosts and channel energies and all that. But really, you're channeling an energy. You're looking at something, and something comes up. So to me, channeling is very much about following your impulse in the moment and trusting that, and looking at what is present in your environment and allow that to become the voice that you're speaking with. And that became almost like a way of teaching for me, like the class that would give me the content of the class. Like when I moved on to Zoom, I thought this won't work on Zoom. And I was really surprised that actually it does, because you can see people and you can, kind of like feel that energy of it. So, and I think to me, that's what I mean when I say channeling in a class. And it comes from all sorts of places. Sometimes, it may come from spirits. I don't know. Sometimes it sort of like comes from an internal space. You feel like you need to say something, and that may be something to do with your journey. And there's also an understanding in that if you're leading a group in a practice, then your journey is relevant too, just like their journey is relevant. You see things in the class, you see things in the group, you feel things, the atmosphere, and that inspires you to say something. And because you're with your yoga thing, and I don't actually think it's an either or. I think you can be channeling and still have a theme. Sometimes I play with that. It's a little bit like that thing. It's sort of like, if you have a theme, keep coming back to it. And that, I can find that challenging. I have to remind myself, just keep, go back.
Set yourself a little alarm every 15 minutes.
Yeah, a little alarm, you must mention. But the thing about that way of teaching is because I think it's about finding a flow and finding a freedom. To teach what is there and what is needed. And the reality is we don't know as we go into a practice, we go into a sequence, we don't know what we're going to meet. We don't know what obstacles our students are going to come up against. And they probably don't know, because they don't know what the sequence is. But, things come up. And I think the more open we are as we go in, the more we are able to respond in the moment. Now, going in open and going in with an open mind and sort of like, that's not the same as going in unprepared.
Exactly.
The preparation is, all the work that we've done in our practice over the years, all the work we've done in our teacher trainings, all the work we've done leading up to a class, all the work we've done in preparing that class, even if it's not like writing down postures and whatever, you still prepare a class. So, for instance, we all as teachers, we study because, if nothing else, just because we're interested, because we're teaching because we're passionate about yoga. So of course we study it, and your preparation is your study. So my theme this week has sort of been about self-observance. So Svataya is the one that I've been using a lot. Not specifically thinking but it's about self-study. And the reason for that was because I read an Instagram post that teacher whose name I forget, Rumi, who's an Indian Ashtanga teacher, and I signed up to his online breath course, and I quite like his teaching style, and he's very very traditional in very many ways. But he wrote a post that was sort of like very specific, kind of struck a chord with me in the way that it defined what we do as a practice, and how the practice allows us to view our identity, view our choices, view our thoughts. So I've been talking a lot about that, and that's sort of like, so self-study's been kind of the teach. That comes out of my preparation, and then because I'm studying that, and because that's in my environment, then I got a lot to say about it, because You've got all these quotes, and if I run out of things to say, then I look up something I read and I might read that out. And also because I studied it, I also see it. So I see things that relate to it. So when I'm teaching, then I see, actually, what's happening here that relates to this topic that I'm in, and that way the class becomes themed all by itself.
No, I think the example of using quotes is really, really nice, because of what you have studied before, what you have seen before, what you've experienced before, and maybe you've also seen it in other yoga classes. It helps you understand and actually theme your classes according to. Do you know 3 other maybe elements or examples of things that we can use to find inspiration? Because I think for many new yoga teachers especially, it can be a little bit challenging sometimes to think of, well, I'm not really sure what to do. I don't know. I'm not inspired. I don't know where to find my inspiration.
Yeah. Inspiration is like, there's so many places we can go for it. Nature, our surroundings, we get inspiration from anywhere. And I would say when we're not inspired, it's usually because we're blocking ourselves or something is blocking us. So things are not really sort of like flowing through us freely. And that happens to all of us. And it's the same thing. And I think in that sense, being a teacher or being a yoga teacher, certainly it is very similar to being an artist. We all talk about inspiration as it's sort of like this holy grail. And it's actually something that, that everybody has, and it applies to it. Everybody's inspired on a daily basis. And sometimes we listen to that and we allow it to flow through us. And sometimes we're not really aware of it. And we feel, I have to come up with an idea for this. And I can't think of anything. I just have no inspiration. So there's a lot of places that we can go to. And, we talked about the studying and the reading. And I mean, I actually find Instagram is a great place for inspiration. I don't use Instagram to study or find deep knowledge, but I do find it's an interesting place to find inspiration. Which we sort of like say, oh yeah, I haven't thought about that for a while.
Exactly.
Because it's these sort of like little fragments you kind of like see, and somebody just like say or something about. You might say, oh, actually, yeah, ahimsa does relate to these things. So there's a lot of ways that we can get inspiration. But the one thing I would say, and this is sort of like, especially when you're new and you're doing something for the first time, it's sort of like, don't overcomplicate it. I mean, I think that's the number one thing that certainly when I was, it's again this thing that we put so much pressure on ourselves that we think we have to be not content with what we are, but we have to be something else. Yeah, and that's a lot of pressure. And that also gives, I have to come up with something brilliant. I have to come up with something that's inspiring, that will inspire my students. And when we think about, the classes and the teachers that really touched us, I quite often find that the teachers that kind of really were kind of like, wow, there was something here where I just really didn't expect that. That it's just really simple.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think when I first started teaching, my theme was breath.
Nice.
Because that's the core of the way I was brought up, or the way I practiced in my early years, and throughout my practice, this thing of moving and breathing and the breath and the moving becoming one is very fundamental to that technique and that specific practice. So for me and for that style of practice, that was an obvious theme. And I don't think I'd teach a class without that at least being a sub theme, because it's just very integral to it. And there's a lot you can say about it.
Oh, absolutely. That's also another conversation.
Yeah.
Many
but the same thing with any of these. So if you say, because we talk about the Yamas and the Niyamas, and with any of these, you could, the same thing, you can keep it very simple and just say, I'm just going to talk about cleanliness in different ways. And before I go into the practice, I'm going to think about what does it mean to me, what are different ways that we can approach cleanliness, what does cleanliness mean, what's the difference between being observing cleanliness and being obsessive compulsive kind of like everything has to be sparkling. What's the difference? Where do we draw the line? What's the balanced approach to that? Is cleanliness the same as purity? Already here, I got a lot of inspiration, and I also got a lot of things where I say, oh my God, I'm not going to go there because that's just going to get too complicated too quick. I'm going to lose the train of thought, or I'm going to lose the track. So we can, from that sort of like brainstorming, you may find, maybe 3 or 4 different points that resonates with you. And I think it's important that the things that we bring in are things that resonate with us, that we feel that we understand, so we feel that we can speak with some kind of authority in it when we share it, and then use those points as inspiration. And I really don't think it has to be that much more than that. We should never put the pressure on ourselves to feel that in a physical asana practice, which is what most of us teach most of the time, that if we choose tapas discipline, that we need to cover that, and we need to give a comprehensive lecture at the same time as we're taking people through a physical sequence, at the same time as we're instructing them on breath, at the same time as we're correcting their alignment, at the same time as all of these things that we're doing, so like the basic yoga thing. We don't have to give them a full lecture where we're covering every aspect of discipline and what discipline means in terms of a yoga practice. I think the purpose of these themes, or of using a limb of yoga or a yama or niyama as a theme in the practice, is to inspire curiosity. So, back in the 90s when yoga classes were a little bit less popular, they tended to maybe run a little bit longer and there was more space, and usually we quite often had, you would have a class and then you would sit down and talk, or you would go for a coffee afterwards with the teacher and with the other students. And then it quite naturally became like, one of the first places conversation fell on would be sort of like, oh, but, you said this about this, and, what does that mean? And, so we quite often, and then it became kind of like a discussion about, and then you start going deeper, into exploring the subject or the theme of the class. And of course, today we may not have that set up in the same way, but you can still inspire something so that when people leave the class, they may be inspired to think about it, or they may be inspired to go and read something about it, or maybe come to you and ask a question about it. So I think that's kind of why we put themes in. It's not that we have to put this pressure on, that we have to do a TED talk that will get people to understand the concept is.
It's like a workshop almost, if you would.
Yeah, and people do workshops on these things. And,
absolutely.
Because they are, you could take any one of these and you could, talk for hours about just that one topic.
Exactly.
Just one yama.
One yama. One at a time. And you, Thomas, is there anything that you would like to add? Anything like tips or techniques?
Maybe just a few examples on how we can, in practical way.
Okay.
So I can't take credit for this myself. I did a class a while back at Recenter in London when that was still there, with a teacher that was she was very much sort of like into her deities and her chanting and, that whole coloral thing, and Durgas and Ganesha and, all these sort of like deities, words flying all over the place. And that was her style. Yeah. And she was doing, and her theme, which she didn't say was the theme, but it was clearly, was Asteya, was non-stealing. And her interpretation of that was to do with abundance. Yeah. So the argument would be that we steal because we feel we don't have enough. We steal because we feel that, so I might nick your idea because I don't trust my own ideas. Yeah. I don't feel there's enough ideas in the world, or whatever. Or I steal a loaf of bread because I don't have enough to eat. So her take on Asteya was very much about lack and abundance. So she was using Om Shri Maha Lakshmiye Namaha, as a chanting thing, which is the chant to invoke Lakshmi, which is the goddess of abundance, and she was using sort of like the repeating mudra would be this one where you're kind of like holding, so it's like you're either receiving or giving to the to the world, to the surroundings, and I thought that was it was so beautiful, because it was like everything kind of like had this sense of giving or receiving. And you kind of ended up with, I kind of left the class with sort of like being, well, the more I give, the more I receive, because everything, it was always, because it was kind of like that circular thing. And I think that's, to me, that was like theming a class in a really successful way. You know, I mean, that was like, a theming masterclass where you just went, wow, and of course, I mean, that way of theming may not be appropriate to everybody. I mean, she was teaching in a yoga center that was very dedicated to the spiritual side and stuff, and so it might not be the right venue to do that in every single place you teach. But it's an example of using things like mudras or chants or things like that relates into your theme, that relates into your yama or your niyama, can be very powerful to play with.
I think so too. No, I think that's a really, really, really nice example. And I do think even now that most of us are actually teaching online, and they maybe now studios are opening up again, but they might also search for places where they can do these things. It shouldn't be, I can't do these themes, or I can't use these themes because my center doesn't allow it. You can also organize events or organize workshops where you can use them, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, I mean, obviously, when we're teaching online, most of us are free to do whatever we want.
Exactly.
I mean, COVID's kind of decimated a lot of the small businesses in London. So a lot of the small yoga centers I used to teach at, where you kind of like had a lot of freedom and you could be very into, nobody was policing what you were teaching as long as you were teaching from a sound place. They don't exist anymore. So, I find that my public teaching or my back to studio teaching is very much sort of like in big corporations and big chains and stuff. And there's always restrictions that come with that. So I run a class in my garden out here every Sunday, because that allows me to teach on my terms. And I feel for my sanity, that's a good thing to do. You can theme a class in a gym where they may have a sort of like, say, don't use Sanskrit. We don't want spiritual wishy-washy thing. People are here for workout, blah, blah. They may say that to you, but that doesn't mean that you can't use a theme. And actually, I think the Yamas and the Niyamas can be very good in that sense. You don't have to say a hinsha to teach about it. Exactly. You don't have to say that you're talking about nonviolence in order to teach about it. The typical thing that I always come to with the nonviolence thing is, how we treat our body, how we approach the posture, how we approach the movement, how we approach the exercise. Are we doing it in an aggressive manner? Are we doing it in a soft manner? Are we doing it in... So you can explore all these things in a lot of different ways.
Exactly.
So I think when we find ourselves in those frustrating situations where people tell us, "Oh, you can't do this thing," I would just sort of like encourage open-mindedness when we approach these things. We don't have to be fixed about what the meaning of something is, or what the meaning of the specific yama or niyama or limb is. Just like we practice open-mindedness when we're practicing, we also, we should study with that open-mindedness.
Yeah.
And I suppose another thing to add, if you're teaching in your second language, or if you're, maybe a little bit insecure about how to put things together and how to, these themes, they can be really useful, because if you study in one language and then teach another language, that's very hard. Like, I was born speaking Danish. That was my native mother tongue. And it should be the language that I speak best. But having lived in the UK for over 25 years, I quite often find that I'm more fluent in English than I'm Danish. And it takes me a little while to switch back into Danish. Now, when I teach in Danish, I really struggle to find my words. And the reason for that is that all my studying is done in English. So my vocabulary within, these forms of things like Yamas and Niyamas comes very readily in English because all the things that I read have been in English. But when I try and say the same things in Danish, I may not know the word. I may not, find, or I might sort of like say it in an awkward way, or I know what I mean, and I know sort of like, but I can't find that specific word, or, I think quite often if you know that you're going to be teaching in another language that's not your natural language, and it's not the language that you studied most of your, teacher training or things in, then I would encourage, find some books and study the subjects of your themes in the language that you're going to teach in, because it will give you a ready vocabulary.
Exactly.
Because I think that's really why we want the themes, is so that we can be fluent in our classes without kind of struggling for things to say, or struggling for content.
Exactly. That's a great point. I was speaking about that with a student this morning. And she said the same thing. I can speak about this in Taiwanese and in Mandarin without any trouble. If it's because I studied it, it's because I did my teacher training in that language. But now that I have to switch to English, I really don't know where to start. And I said the same as you said. Reading is one of the best things, but also getting involved in conversations like we are having at the moment. To do exercises online, to practice yoga in the other language, and just really, really put yourself out there to stay active in your learning journey, yoga wise, but also doing all of that in the other language, whether it's English. But some people here, I know that Paula, for example, she's an English teacher but wants to learn how to teach in Spanish. So it always works both ways.
No, and exactly, because I think just that you're proficient in a language doesn't mean that you're going to feel fluent teaching in that language.
Yeah, because absolutely. Those are two skills.
Yeah. Like I was trying to think yesterday, I was trying to think in Danish how I would say lumbar spine or lower back. And it took me about 10 minutes before I found, because there is a word, and I was explaining it all about, the lower part of your spine, the blah, 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 blah. And it took me about 10 minutes before I came up with that. Now, obviously, if I talk directly, in English, or, then that word is just there because I've been using it all my teaching life, and I use it every day. And,
exactly.
And I think, so I really do think read in the language that you intend to teach in. And if that's more than one language, read.
Read all of them.
And the conversations as well, because I think when you're talking as well, it's sort of like the process of searching for a word, is useful. I always tell this story when I told my dad and his friend to die about 125 times during an online class of beginners yoga, because the word I used for exhale, the way I put it together grammatically in Danish, is when you say take your last breath, basically. That was what I kept telling them. And they thought it was hilariously funny, of course, but,
take your last breath.
But because I had that conversation afterwards and they made fun of me for doing it, I will never do that again.
Well, that's true. We learn from our mistakes. And I always say, a lot of people are very afraid of making mistakes because they don't want to come off as a fool, or they don't want to be seen as not knowing enough, or maybe not being proficient enough in whatever it is that they do. But actually, these mistakes are so necessary to improve and to become better. And asking for feedback or receiving feedback, even if you haven't asked for it necessarily, really, really, really helps with becoming better at what you want to be better at. In this case, teaching. Very nice. Thomas, thank you so much for joining and for your time and for sharing your wisdom once again. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Likewise. And anytime.
Thank you, everyone that's been watching. of course, if you have any questions, anything that you would like to comment or share, send a message here on Instagram or on Facebook. If you're not in the Facebook group already, it's called the Teach Yoga and English Support Group. And there we answer more questions like these. And you can seek support or maybe ask help for anything that you find difficult or challenging when you teach yoga and English.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. See you later.
Yeah.
You listen to Your Yoga in English, brought to you by Enga Unite, a unique online learning platform for non-native English-speaking yogis and yoga teachers. If you feel inspired and liked what you learned today, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, and follow us at Enga Unite and become a member of our online community, Your Yoga in English, on Facebook. Practice, rest, repeat, and all will come.